Greetings, everyone. I have the great privilege of being able to MC this conversation. We're all extremely grateful to Anthony Morgan and to the Philosopher for giving us this venue. I am a fan of this book, and so my role is really to be fanboy here and help those who are tuning in and haven't yet gotten their copies because it's just off the presses today. Tell you a little bit why it's worth your time. We're going to get into the content of the book. I want to first ask Dani and Perry a little bit about their positionality in the Academy to get a sense of where they're coming from in writing this book. You heard already that Dani is a philosopher. That Dani is a neuroscientist. See, that's the kind of crossover we get in this book. That they're both in some ways neuroscientists and both in some ways philosophers, but by professional vocation, Dani is a neuroscientist, Perry's a philosopher. Perry, what is critical social theory?
Critical social theory, well, social theory would be something that a field that analyzes the social, or how it is that we are with one another, how we want to be with one another, how we organize ourselves as society. Critical social theory builds on the tradition of critical theory, which asks about the conditions for possibility of a thing. So how is it that society is even possible, that the way in which we organize ourselves is even possible? Are there other ways to organize ourselves that are possible, right? And specifically, critical social theory attends to the materiality of the way in which we organize ourselves. What are the buildings? What are the structures of movement, spaces, and how it is that they came to be the way that they are, and then how it is that we might change them. So I think a lot about political resistance movements in that, like, how do we change them sort of way.
Great. And Dani, network neuroscience, what the heck?
Yeah. So network neuroscience is a blend between two fields: neuroscience, which is the study of the brain and neural systems, and then network science, which is the study of networks or patterns of connections between items. So when you put those two pieces together, what you get is a way of thinking about the brain as composed of lots of independent units, many neurons, many individual neural units or ensembles, and then how they're connected up, how they're wired up, and how that wiring impacts how the system can function. So I really like to think about the analogy of a roadway system. So what network neuroscience is doing is trying to understand how the way the roads work impacts what the brain can do and how that's different in each of us.
Amazing. So, okay, somebody reading these job descriptions might wonder, how can these two authors, yeah, you're twins, you're both brilliant, but how can authors with such different academic orientations write a book together? In the opening of your book, you talk about divvying up the chapters, and you say you make no effort at cohesion. As a reader, as a close reader 2 times, I can say I found the book extremely cohesive. Theoretically, stylistically, there are themes that weave through, but also almost just a perspective that is constant in ways and refracted through all these different lenses in ways that seems to be really coherent. So can you just say a little bit about your process? Would you write chapters and then swap, where the other would then come in and add some further copy? How's that going to work?
Yeah, we definitely wrote the chapters separately in different time periods. You know, like I had to leave a semester, so I got a bunch of chapters done. Then Dani, I don't know what happened to you. You cleared some decks, canceled a bunch of meetings and wrote some things, you know. But we were really saturated in each other's thought for a while before we really put it out. I think when we first had the idea, we thought, okay, great, let's just sit down and write it. And we were like, well, we're not actually ready. And so we authored a lot of papers together in psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy to start thinking about these concepts and working some things out. So when we set about actually writing, it came much more easily. And I think we'd already done some of that stitching. Dani, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think intellectually and in a scholarly way, we were definitely connecting ideas for 5-ish years before we really put a lot on paper. But then you also note that stylistically there's a similarity. And I think that actually came about as we were writing. So over the course of those 5 to 7 years, we ended up writing more and more similarly. The voice was eerily the same. I would read a passage that he wrote and I was like, that sounds like I wrote it. And he would read a passage that I wrote and say the same thing. So I think that there was a way in which both the ideas and the way of presenting the ideas, or the style of presenting the ideas, kind of came together in tighter and tighter format. So we describe the book as a dialogue, but I think it's more than that. I think it is creating this fabric, this interconnected fabric of ideas, and illustrating those ideas in the way we write. The style is actually illustrative of the concepts, rather than just being didactic.
Well said. I was going to ask you too. I mean, the dialogue descriptor struck me while reading it as a little off in the sense that you really do have a way of writing as one voice. You're in dialogue with your collective self in some way, and of course with lots of others, human and otherwise, throughout. But it does hang together. One more question just about the book itself. It is a gorgeous book. I mean, the prose is gorgeous, the writing is gorgeous, the conception is gorgeous. But it's also a visually very satisfying book, in no small part due to the inclusion of frontispieces before every chapter by an artist by the name of Poonam Mistry. So I want to hear a little bit about how you discovered Mistry's work and why you included her work. Why are the pictures at all in this? So what's that work doing for us here?
Dani, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. So we were really excited to have someone put together visual aids that illustrated some of the concepts in the chapters. And we searched around for a while to find somebody who could do these frontispieces. And we found Poonam Mistry, who is an artist in the UK, and whose work is really focused on both nature and patterns. And as you read the book, you'll realize that those two pieces are really fundamental to the arguments that we are making. So her work was just a perfect fit, stylistically and kind of conceptually, to what we were trying to do. So when we asked her to be part of this endeavor, she was very excited and thrilled. And then I immediately sent her a 320-page visual portfolio of our book, by which I mean that we took a sentence and then added a picture that illustrated the idea of the sentence, and then another sentence a few sentences later and a picture that illustrated that idea, so that she could see visually what we were seeing. Because while we write in prose, we have images in our minds constantly. And so we wanted her to be able to see that and then build from that something that was artistic in this really sophisticated fashion that only she could do.
I love that. And I love that you're visual thinkers, and I love that you have the courage to say that in a book that's basically a work of philosophy and neuroscience, that's important. We often think that our medium is the word, and academic writing, even if it's reaching a broad audience, has to be verbal. But the idea that ideas can be contained and can be conveyed through imagery, I think, is something we all need to think more about. It's very rare to say to an audience, buy this book just for its pictures if you don't feel like reading it, because it's just a great art book. Included in its visuals too, and I won't take the time to ask you about this, but just to flag for readers, you made the wonderful decision to have your diagrams be hand-drawn. So readers who pick this up are in for a treat. And they're just, I don't know, I've just been reading a lot of Vernon Lee, who was a turn of the century esthetician who talks a lot about vitality and the notion that art is a interactive process. Viewing a picture, you bring yourself to it in a very embodied way, and something about the hand-drawn line, especially for very geometric kind of diagrams or flowcharts that might otherwise be technical or off-putting, brings in a kind of life that I think is inspiring and rare to see. So people can look forward to that as well. Okay. Curiosity, let's get into it. First of all, I want to ask you, does curiosity have a history? So as a student of the emotions, I've been really impressed over the last couple of decades that there's been an increasing rise of interest in emotions as an object of historical study. You have a whole subfield within history looking at the emotions and centers of research that focus on that. And I was struck in your text how you bring in historical perspectives on your topic. One thing that has sometimes puzzled me in reading work by historians on emotions is there's an ambiguity. Sometimes they settle one way or the other between two possibilities in saying emotions have a history. One is just that over time, conceptions, beliefs, attitudes towards emotions have changed, where the emotions themselves are kind of fixed biologically or in some other way. Another view would say that emotions have transformed over time as a result of these changes in beliefs and attitudes. And I know we're going to get into this in a minute. I know that curiosity isn't exactly an emotion for you, but I did, in reading some of your historical exegesis, wonder whether you think curiosity is something that changes over time and what that looks like.
One of the things that certainly the conception of curiosity has changed over time. So we do highlight that curiosity was thought of fairly poorly, right, as a very superficial, empty interest in things that generally makes us just shallow human beings. So that's a much older sense of curiosity. And I don't think that that sense of curiosity is very well alive today. I do think it shows up a little bit in our disparagement of social media practices, for example. But generally, I don't think it marks today. So the conception of curiosity has changed, but has curiosity itself changed? Really interesting question. I don't think we would immediately say that it hasn't changed, but we would say there are some things that haven't about it. And that would be certain styles of curiosity that we have worked on together. So I've talked a little bit about 3 different styles that kind of pop up across the history of philosophy and Western intellectual history. The busybody, the hunter, and the dancer. The busybody is interested in lots of different things, has lots of open tabs. The hunter is much more focused, really wants to know everything about something small. So if you're obsessed with Harry Potter paraphernalia, right, like that's huntering. Or the dancer is someone who is much more interested in imagining what could I possibly do with the weird facts that are in the world or the random experiences and sensations that I'm having. What could I imaginatively do with these things? So those 3 styles, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just that those 3 styles are kind of historically pretty regular. And what we've done is we've been able to sort of test out, well, are they still styles of curiosity today?
Great. So in talking about those 3 styles, having framed it with your earlier remark, Perry, that curiosity was at one point discouraged. There's a wonderful book by Daston and Park on History of Wonder, where they talk about a kind of period in which a certain kind of bewilderment, a kind of curiosity that didn't go anywhere, but sort of wallowed in mystery, was strongly encouraged. And then with enlightenment and scientific revolution, according to their narrative, that gets discouraged. All these are ways of kind of policing curiosity. And the theme of policing curiosity arises in the book. We'll come to it again when we talk about pedagogy in a few minutes. But while on this notion of styles, one thing that I was struck by in reading your characterization of the busybody, hunter, and dancer is I got the impression that there was some normative voice in that taxonomy, and that you were in saying in some way some forms of curiosity are better than others. So the busybody might be somebody who's nosy, who's getting into other people's business. The hunter is maybe very utilitarian, maybe almost a kind of capitalist mindset. There's a monetary value in finding this piece of information. Let me just go in a mercenary way. Even the metaphor of hunter, you didn't use forager, I noticed. The metaphor of hunter has a violence inherent in it. And then you end with the dancer, and you quote Nietzsche describing a remark where he uses that metaphor as one of the best lines in the history of philosophy, which I liked. Is this an ordered list? Are these getting better?
Yeah, I think I do think that in philosophy anyway, I think these are in a sense chronological emphases. So I think early on in philosophy, there was a real emphasis on curiosity as busybodying. around the early modern period, there's a real shift. And I think it's to a more hunter-like understanding of curiosity as we get into modern science, early modern science. And then if you want, you could think about existentialism and post-structuralism more as the invitation to dance with your curiosity and being less grounded, literally, in certain philosophical foundations.
So Dani, Perry just characterized the scientific approach as hunting. Do you find that there are ways within science to be a dancer?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the dancers in science are typically those individuals who do more interdisciplinary work. So who are building bridges, leaping among ideas or subspaces of inquiry. I also think that there's a lot of room to be busybody-like too, in the sense that I think it's important to canvas disparate fields for relevant ideas that might need to be stitched together. Particularly in computational science, there can be methods that are developed in one field that haven't yet been ported over into another one, but turns out are exactly what you need to test a new hypothesis. So I think that expansive questioning that really is open to breaking boundaries or dismissing boundaries is really important on both sides.
Right. So we've gotten a hint of what curiosity is indirectly. We've been told it has styles. I hinted before that you resist the idea that curiosity is an emotion. I think in ordinary discussions of curiosity, people tend to gravitate towards one of two default assumptions. One is that curiosity is an emotion, and the other is that it's a trait of character. Both of those come up in your book. Both of them are resisted in various ways. So if curiosity is not an emotion and not a trait, what is it?
Yeah, I think that, so I'm not going to go on a limb and say that it's not an emotion. I would say that what I've been trying to focus on is the curiosity as a practice. And that's because a long history of thinking, there's a long history of thinking curiosity as a desire to know. And that desire has typically been super individualized and typically also acquisitional, so that I desire to get some piece of knowledge. I'm interested, and we're interested in thinking about curiosity instead as relational, as a way of building relationships between ideas and concepts, first of all, in some kind of network of knowledge, but also between people, relational between people. We ask questions together. We don't just they don't just pop up in us in the way that a lot of people think about personality traits or emotions as being very individual likewise. So I'm sure there's ways we could re-understand personality traits and emotions such that they're relational and social, and I know you've done a lot of work on that yourself. But focusing on what it does, this practice, has been my avenue in here, and it helps really get expanded through sort of network thinking from Dani's angle.
So in saying that curiosity is about relations between ideas, and contrasting that with the view that curiosity is not just about acquisition of knowledge, especially individual knowledge, can we really push that to the limit and say curiosity is not in the business of knowledge at all? How far do we want to go?
Dani, you want to jump in on that? It sounds like you're excited about that one.
That's just like that's an interesting suggestion. I think it depends a lot on whether you think knowledge is the bits of information or whether you think knowledge is also present in the relations among pieces of information. And as so long as the knowledge is also present in the relations, then curiosity is in the business of knowledge, but we're rethinking what knowledge means so that it's not individual units of data. It is how those pieces fit together into something broader.
I like that. I as a emotion scholar, you're always trying to figure out what each emotion's job profile is. What is it? Why do we have it? What is it? What is it after? And I like the provocation of suggesting that curiosity is not, after all, doing what we typically characterize it as doing, or putting it, I think, as you just did in a way, Dani, as a dilemma. Either it's not just about knowledge attainment, or we need to rethink what knowledge is. And I do think if we start to think about knowledge as connections between ideas, you can see how curiosity, interesting as it is a subject in its own, can also be a route to discovering a whole new way of thinking about the nature of knowledge and information. So that's very exciting. Relatedly, edge work. What is edge work? And what does it have to do with curiosity?
Yeah, so in network neuroscience, a network is built out of nodes and edges. The nodes are the things like the pieces of knowledge, and then the edges are the relationships between them. So you can imagine that you know or have seen a squirrel, you know or have seen an acorn, but you don't really know them until you know the relationship, as in the acorn is a source of food for the nibbling squirrel. When we think about curiosity as this capacity to build connections, therefore, we recharacterize it not as an acquisition of the node, the information that is squirrel or is acorn, but rather the building of the edge. So curiosity is edge work, edging around, we say.
I love that squirrels feature in this. I dedicated my last book to a squirrel, and I'm dedicating the book I'm writing to 3 squirrels. So they're important members of my life. You make the case that we can learn things from non-human animals. For those who are contemplating buying the book, I'll give you another sufficient reason. The book ends with a bestiary. And I read this, I blew my mind, and I was thinking, what if every book ended with a bestiary, with an effort to think through how this topic would be informed by looking at non-human animals? So can you say something about what we can learn from non-human animals in the study of curiosity?
Yeah, Danny, you want to jump into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So these 3 styles that Perry was talking about earlier, so the busybody, the hunter, and the dancer, are ones that have been excavated from Western intellectual thought over the last 2,000 years. There are other bodies of thought that are important and have images and beings for us to learn from. And then there's also just the nature of animal life, independent of human description. That also illustrates some beautiful styles of curiosity. So what we do in the bestiary is to pull from additional literatures, but also just from animal science to say, here are the kinds of curiosity that these different animals can evince. And the reason we do that is that we don't think necessarily that those 3 styles, the busybody, hunter, and dancer, are the only ones. We think that there's a whole additional set, and that our readers, our listeners, each of us may see ourselves in very different styles, either these 3 beings or the beasts at the end. And by noticing that we see these differently in each of us, I think we can come to a place where we respect and value and laud seeing different kinds of curiosity in other individuals. So seeing that kind of animal nature evinced in very different ways.
And one thing that comes through in the book throughout is this looking for other perspectives. It's an interdisciplinary volume. It's an interspecies volume in a way. It's also a volume where effort is made to think about epistemological perspectives coming from other intellectual traditions outside of the West and the contemporary Western Academy. You talk, for example, at length about perspectives from disability. You also talk at even greater length about perspectives from indigenous epistemologies. So can you say something about the place of indigenous epistemology in developing your ideas about curiosity, and also maybe more generally about what we all have to learn from that work?
Yeah. When you start talking about networks of knowledge and how they get built and whose curiosity gets to build them, that is, whose questions sort of get taken up and get accepted as building these things we call knowledge, it's really important to think about what knowledge structures exist that aren't recognized as such. So traditions of knowledge, especially indigenous traditions of knowledge, but also other traditions that are built in particular social groups and networks that have not sort of dominated history as we know it. And so we're interested not just in the fact that curiosity builds knowledge networks, but how power structures inform which knowledge networks really get a say in what things are or how things work, and which ones haven't been able to haven't gotten that kind of uptake and therefore have been silenced in particular ways, erased in particular ways, suppressed in particular ways. So Indigenous knowledge is certainly one of those things, and especially relevant for those of us who are working in the US today as a colonial place.
And would you say that the history of curiosity in the West is a colonial history?
Yes, I would. And in fact, we explicitly characterize this acquisitional approach to knowledge as a typically colonial approach to knowledge, right? That you as an individual knower get to go look at something you want to know and get to go grab it out of its context and take it home and do something with it you want to do. That's that's how colonial museums are crafted and knowledge structures are crafted. But if we want to think differently, we want to think about the relationship in which that information already sits and start to come into relationship with it, building some kind of relationship with that piece of knowledge and the people and the other knowledges around which it sits. That's how knowledge should grow in an anti-colonial, decolonial way.
I've been quite struck thinking about the history of Western philosophy through the lens of the colonial contact with the world outside of Europe. And if you think just about, classics, two obvious examples being the state of nature concept in Hobbes's work on government, or the opening book of John Locke's Inquiry into Human Understanding, what you find there is an excitement and enthusiasm, an effort to coalescence from their perceptions of mostly the Americas, things that were coming in and entering into popular discussion. But their discussions are really a form of violence. You find in their characterizations all kinds of pejorative and misdescriptions of this world of encounter, but also an effort to contain and control them, to describe them, to use them as an other, as a principle of contrast. For the state of nature concept, you get sometimes an idealization of that, like in Rousseau, but that kind of romantic, noble savage idea is equally problematic. And then, of course, these things become a segue into civilizing projects where you get European powers trying to come in and contain ways of being in the world in these places where they want control and domination. So as an academician, as somebody who writes, there's always this challenge of how one can make use of knowledges outside of one's own background, and not do that, not have this colonial takeover. So clearly there's a very robust danger of colonialism to ignore other epistemologies. How do we counteract the parallel danger of using them in ways that share or expose or accurately represent those knowledges rather than appropriating?
Yeah, I think that one of the things is to recognize that not all Indigenous thinkers agree with one another. So to recognize, again, the relations that already exist within this particular knowledge structure. So one of the things that we do in the last chapter is talk about Leanne Bedamosaki Simpson's work alongside Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, and trying to think the different ways in which they tell a similar story about Indigenous curiosity, and to kind of honor the complexity that is already there. That's at least one thing that I think is really important.
Maybe another perspective on that to add from the science point of view is that you can be supporting a colonial view of knowledge by not crossing the boundary into another field, right? So informally, there are conversations in science like, who's the person who owns the hippocampus? Who's the person who owns the prefrontal cortex? Who's the person who owns this bit of visual cortex? And that feels very, very kind of colonial, like, okay, there's a flag that's been staked on this piece of the tissue of the brain, right, that it's owned by somebody, and so then you don't, maybe there's the undercurrent of like, you don't walk on that territory because somebody else owns it already. And I think that I think it's important for every scientist of any age and any background to say, no, all of this is for all of us to ask. And so I think there's a different view of colonialism that you could push back against by saying, even though that piece of information may be outside of my current background, it is still open for everyone to ask about, and illustrate that inquiry, that broad, expansive inquiry to the young people who are coming after us.
Yeah, I mean, that is really something that comes through in the book. There's so much permeability between boundaries. Even talking about permeability seems to inflate the role that boundaries play in this book. It's a book without walls, and a real model for how to do a kind of interdisciplinary engagement. Let me ask you a couple more political questions, and then I really want to get to our Q&A, because we have a very impressive audience and their thoughts are important. Does curiosity have a dark side? So Perry's written a little bit about this, and some other work comes out in the book in some ways. Curiosity can be invasive. It can be dehumanizing. So the book, in a way, is a celebration of curiosity, but there are these moments of caution that come out. So what are your views about curiosity's dark side?
Yeah, I would say that there's a contrast that is really useful for me between curiosity about and curiosity with. And curiosity about typically maintains this really this significant distance between the knower and the known. And the known is an object and the knower is a subject. And that kind of formation of curiosity about, lends itself to all kinds of violence, whether that's when we're knowing about the earth and the planet and using it for our own ends, or about a kind of social group that we're not familiar with. And historically, right, there's a lot of objectification and fetishization of cultures that may be different from your own, etc. So the curiosity about is one of the dangers, and I associate that in this book. Like, I think about it in relationship to the acquisitional model of curiosity. I'm here to get this information, this knowledge that is this object out here. Whereas curiosity with necessitates that me and the thing I want to know are already in a shared space, already in shared relation, and so there has to be a way I behave and the way I listen that is entirely different. But yeah, that's where I would start. Dani, I don't know if you want to talk about any other violences of curiosity.
No, but maybe just an antidote at some point is to turn to the curiosity of different sorts of individuals in the classroom who may be coming from really different perspectives, and celebrating those differences as a not dark, very happy way to conversation at some point.
Dani, you read my mind. That's a segue. I'm about to ask you about pedagogy, and then we'll open it up. But sort of pressing on the dark side a little bit, wonders whether one can be too curious. And you mentioned in the book, you used the phrase epistemologies of ignorance. So many in our audience will know that there's been a lot of work recently, like by my dear late colleague Charles Mills, Jose Medina, and others, on the idea that we can be actively ignorant. There are people in positions of power and privilege who put blinders on in some way so that they do not expose themselves to information that could problematize their comfort in their position of power. And the flip side, though, is one does wonder whether there might be cases of curiosity going too far, being too prying, being too probing. You mentioned the cliche curiosity killed the cat in the bestiary, and you give it a kind of positive spin. I mean, I think we usually think of it as a kind of creepy thing. It's an admonition. If you tell people curiosity killed the cat in context, it usually probably means stop asking so many questions. We usually think of that as a kind of bad thing to say, but maybe it has an application. Maybe there are places where it's not a bad thing to say. One platitude where this might come out is the idea that ignorance is bliss, that we should allow ourselves to embrace not knowing, not understanding. So can we be too curious? Is that ever a thing?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I argue in my previous book, Curiosity and Power, is that curiosity should always have companions. So if curiosity is the only thing that's driving you, probably you're too curious. Probably there are ways in which the curiosity goes too far, goes awry, and starts to do more of this violence, more of this, I'm learning about this for me, right? But if curiosity has companions, like respect and joy and belonging, and difference, then I think it, in its own context, it will be beautiful.
Pedagogy. Okay, so another wonderful feature of the book is you have a chapter on pedagogy, and it's a theme really throughout. The two of you were homeschooled, so that's an interesting thing that will, I think, raise some curiosity. I'm curious, for instance, about how you transition, how it felt to transition from homeschooling into a conventional classroom setting, and what lessons you have brought from that experience, from having had an unconventional early education, to your own pedagogical practice and your own ways of learning.
Dani?
Yeah, so I think that it was definitely surprising going into a regular classroom. It was not like anything that I expected, even though I had read lots of books
stressful
about
was
what
so
a classroom
stressed.
was like. Yeah, yeah, it was the emotions, the
stressful,
history of
yeah.
emotions in our lives at the transition from homeschooling to classes. That we should talk about that. But also I think, so a little bit of background on the way that we were homeschooled. So our mom gave us a lot of individual, or she wanted our learning to be self-driven. So she would ask us at the beginning of every unit what we were interested in learning about, and then she would find materials for us. So I wanted to learn about bones. She would help me to understand, to get material about the science of bones, the history of medicine around bones, visual illustrations of bones, how people draw bones, etc. So she would pull together many different fields and then have it all around focused on that one topic. So I think what's exciting and what's really fun about that way of growing up is that we were, the interdisciplinarity of inquiry was foregrounded in our education. That was always the way that we learned. And then the second thing that was foregrounded is being self-driven. So, and that's what we're doing today as professors, is that we wake up every morning and we say, what do we want to learn about? What do we want to learn? What do we want to ask? What are the questions that are most exciting to us? So those two pieces, the interdisciplinarity and the self-driven inquiry, I think are what we took largely from that experience, that has been really a lot of fun. And that changes how certainly we view what we do in the classroom. But maybe I'll turn it over to Perry to talk about ideas in the classroom.
Yeah, so Perry, how does schools quash curiosity, and how can they be better?
Yeah, I think one of the primary ways in which schools squash curiosity is by being really limited in the way that we as facilitators of learning perceive curiosity. So I think we're trained to expect it to come through with a student who asks a lot of questions, who looks us in the eye a lot, who raises their hand actively, right? Who's just marking down lots of notes, who writes long papers, sits in the front, right? That person, those are just kind of classic characteristics of a curious student, I think, for most higher ed and even K through 12 classrooms. That's just not everybody. That's just not everybody's way of showing curiosity. There's so many different ways of understanding or of practicing curiosity, and of making these connections in our head and between each other, and of holding those connections. So I think we talk a bunch about neurodiversity and neuroatypicality in the book, and how we need to understand that that signifies a different way of structuring information in someone's head and holding that information or stretching or changing the kind of architectures of that information. And I don't think professors or K through 12 teachers are ready yet to really expand what that means for how we structure what we do together. So that's one of the injunctions, is that we need to start thinking much more richly about the curiosities in the room and how to facilitate them.
Do you think there are ways outside of the classroom we can be doing that as well? You mentioned, for example, Olav Worm, who had one of the more famous cabinets of curiosities. So collecting is something you can do. You have a whole chapter, a wonderful chapter on walking, on taking walks. So are the two of you walkers? Are you collectors? Are there things you do outside of your research that make curiosity just part of the flow of your life?
Dani?
I collect paper knives. So these are knives that were used to open books when books used to be constructed such that the pages were just folded, not actually cut. So I am a small collector in that way. I also love hiking, so a walker too. Perry?
Yeah, and I'm a pocket knife collector. I started collecting pocket knives when one of my grandfathers died and left me one. And I'm also a huge walker. Walk all the time. Mostly for mushrooms, but also just to walk.
What's your favorite mushroom?
Oh, that's an impossible question.
A favorite. What's a recent good find?
You know, one of the really earliest ones was an ink cap that just, when I was little, I just thought, wow,
Indigo?
really? There's like
Indigo?
ink in mushrooms? Wow.
Was it indigo?
It wasn't. No, it was one of the shaggy ink caps.
Shaggy, yeah. We'll have to have that conversation one day. Okay, let's go to the questions. Lots of great questions. The first on the question list is from Fiona Naylor, who asked, can curiosity be playful, both within knowledge and relations? Playful curiosity.
Short answer, yes. Dani?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I think about playful, I think about sort of the selfless loss of self, maybe a lot of authenticity, intellectual humility, engaging in curiosity in a way that is thoroughly entranced with the bit of wonder, I think. And yeah, absolutely. That's a great one.
The next question is actually very much the lines of a question I asked, except stated so much better, and you've really already answered, but I can't resist just the sharing of this way of putting it from Sam Collins. He says, a common saying that I struggle to grapple with, in fact, is ignorance is bliss. And he says, in this, curiosity leads to a fall from grace. Eve eating the apple in the Garden of Eden, it was her curiosity that made her conscious. Running with this metaphor, I'm glad that she was curious, giving rise to consciousness, because I enjoy realizing reality. Though some may say that it was a mistake of her to eat the apple because ignorance is bliss. So putting this as a question, he says, my question is there a point where curiosity becomes a crux? Can we have too much of a good thing? Feel free to say more, but I feel like maybe you've already answered that one. I just wanted to share the Eve saga as a cautionary tale about curiosity that has a pretty foundational role in our Western culture.
Yeah, I would just add, it reminds me of when I took some of my first kind of feminism and gender studies classes, and how I felt like my world just was blown open, but it also like made it harder. Knowing ways of recognizing certain things in the world that aren't okay made it harder to live with those things, harder to ignore those things. So I think about Eve this way, that on the one hand, I'm so glad, right, that this story goes the way it goes, and she just, tries it and has her mind expanded. And on the other hand, it seems so real that life was also harder after that. Knowledge isn't always easy.
You're here. The next question from Joanna Bailey, who begins by thanking you so much for this. Also here. Please, can you say something more about the link between engaging in certain kinds of curiosity and being excluded or disregarded within academia? I read that you consider Gloria Anzaldúa, excuse me, as an example of this. What was her dangerous curiosity? And in the book, you give a number of examples of really major scholars and creators who were discouraged early on.
Yeah, Dani, do you want to take this one?
Well, because it's about Gloria Anzaldúa, I feel like you should.
Okay, I was just gonna say, I mean, I was gonna set you up to say that, you know, I think we often face critiques for the kind of work that we do, also, and that so the policing of work that is interdisciplinary, or in my case, especially concerned with marginalized groups, is really real. And for Gloria Anzaldúa, you know, she was working at she's a Chicana feminist writing in the 80s and 90s. She's working and thinking on the border between Mexico and the US. And she insists, you know, we have to think about, for her, we have to think about what a border life is. What a border life is between reason and spirituality, between men and women for her, between straight and queer, between certainly between these two countries, and geographical spaces, right? We have to think borders and border thoughts. And her work was, yeah, not welcome in her PhD program and in the schools where she taught. And then it just took off and sort of lit the landscape of feminism and Latinx studies, and continues to just like change hearts to this day with the passion of her writing. So just, yeah, read more Anzaldúa is one thing to say here.
There are some wonderful cameos and co-stars who appear in this book, but Anzaldúa is really one of the important ones, and it's a great advertisement for her work. The next question also is a better formulation in some ways of something we touched on, but I will read it because it raises some issues in a different way. This is coming from Jana Basevich, I may be mispronouncing, forgive me. As a relational ontologist of knowledge, I am delighted to hear about your work. However, I'm wondering about one thing. You talk of relations and connections, it seems, I have not yet read your book, primarily as successful or happy in Austinian terms. How does the idea of connections as also negative, harmful, and undesirable, as in, for instance, the meaning of saying curiosity killed the cat, fit into your theory? So more on the dark side.
Yeah, well, and also maybe just drawing on the bit about connections that are undesirable, negative, or harmful. So I think that maybe you already read the conclusion of our book, but the conclusion of our book is about cracks, and about what connections in the networks that we have built need to crack in order to allow for new ideas to form, or new formations of knowledge to function. And so we definitely emphasize not just the laying down of connections that are positive and constructive, but also the breaking of connections that are no longer serving us in the efforts that we are taking part in our world to make our world a better place.
And concretely, one of the ways in which we think about that is through citation practices. So we also have written a bunch of papers on citation ethics. And we think about the ways in which we over and over again quote particular people in our respective fields. And so each of those is a connection, right? But insofar as those structures themselves lift up particular voices steadily, right? And such white scholars, male scholars, etc., and not others, they are troubling or negative connections. And we need to think more carefully about the connections we build with.
Yeah, well said. I think here too about some of the empirical work on implicit bias, implicit association tests, and how forming connections can certainly be harmful. Ronald Gross asks about your notion of curiosity as a relational practice, and asks, given the relationality, what is the role of conversation in this enterprise?
I mean, I thought a lot about listening, and we write a lot about listening. And I try to actually rethink the busybody, the hunter, and the dancer as listeners, different kinds of listeners. But I haven't really thought about conversing, which obviously listening presumes.
But
Dani?
you'll also notice in the book that we move from more formal prose or more artistic prose into more conversational prose at certain points. And the sketches that we have in the book are explicitly meant to be conversational. It's us communicating directly to the reader in this very temporally narrow place and time. And so I think that conversation becomes a way of sharing information and sharing curiosity with one another to ask new questions. We also, I would say, the book is peppered with lots and lots and lots of questions, not all of which we answer for ourselves or for anyone else. And I think those are to motivate conversations with yourself, conversations with your friends, conversations in the academy, outside the academy. So yes, I think conversation is central.
Great. And I know we're at the time where we're scheduled to end this conversation, but taking some liberty and knowing that some audience members may need to leave, what do you say we go for another 5 minutes just to get a few of the remaining questions in? Okay. We have a question from Anne Vroom, who argues, who asks, would you say that curiosity is a predicate to all knowledge? That is, curiosity as a desire, a passion in the Aristotelian or Thomistic sense?
That's interesting. I wonder, we might have different perspectives on this, Perry. I'm curious what you think. But I do know that as long as you are open to experience, there are ways of building knowledge that are implicit, that when our brains have stimuli flowing into them, our brains will build models of the world. And that's not necessarily because we've actively engaged in a particular practice, except to be open to experience. So I think I'm wrestling with, if openness to experience is consistent with the desire idea, then yes. And if not, then no, we can build knowledge even without an active desire. I don't know.
Yeah,
Right?
and I was thinking about the passive kind of taking in of knowledge structures of value in a society, that we just sort of imbibe how it is that 2 and 2 are put together, and we value this and we don't value that, and hopefully at someday, at some point we start questioning all those things that we've just sort of inherited. But the inheriting of knowledge certainly happens. I don't think we're actively building it when we're inheriting it. We're just inheriting it. So I would say curiosity, we argue that curiosity is at the foundation of building knowledge networks, actually putting edges down between nodes, but we can certainly acquire knowledge by other means.
Great. We're going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. An anonymous attendee asks, one area where my curiosity tends to break down is in relation to my ideological opponents. How can your account of curiosity help us work with political polarization?
I think it helps us understand why political polarization makes conversations hard, because it's really a clash of networks of knowledge, right? So there's whole networks of knowledge, there's big hubs of things that are strongly believed, and lots of, laying down of edge after edge after edge. It's like these things are connected, and this is why, and this is how. And then when you don't have a whole lot of lines going between the 2 networks, it's really hard to talk across them. Really, really hard. And so one of the things that you'd have to do is to take 2 networks and start building some of those bridges that do that bridge work. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, I'm just going to ask this one final question. Another one just appeared, but I'm going to try and respect your time and end by 5 after. So John Fish Hodgson asks, the book opens with an epigraph from Audre Lorde. Another line of Lorde's is relevant to pedagogy. Lorde says, quote, "The learning process is something you can incite, literally incite like a riot. And then just possibly, hopefully, it goes home or on," unquote. So Hodgson asks, can curiosity be incited? A good question to end on.
Dani, how about that pedagogy example you often tell of the
Oh.
unexpected paper?
Oh, yeah. So related to pedagogy, perhaps, I think it's important to open up spaces to allow students to respond in ways that are that illustrate their curiosity. So for example, in a class that I taught in the spring, a student, rather than submitting an essay for the class, actually wrote a sort of novelette in the frame of Alice in Wonderland. And it actually had the Mad Hatter, and it had Alice, and it had the Queen of Hearts, and etc. And amazingly illustrated the ideas of the entire class so clearly in this wildly different genre. And so I was really excited to see that as an illustration of this student's curiosity and knowledge evinced in a very, very different way. And I think making room for that is really exciting. We do in the book talk about mentoring and about how we mentor one another, and we mentor to people older than us, to people younger than us. And I think about mentoring as a way of inciting curiosity. I definitely know that my curiosity has been incited just by a mentor not doing anything specifically toward me, but showing me the way they ask questions or the way that they cross boundaries. So I think that's an exciting way to make a couple riots.
Great. And maybe just because we're quoting Audre Lorde, what about people whose experience has led them to think they shouldn't be curious, or that their questions don't matter, or accrual of networks or of knowledges are not part of their life's worth? How do we incite curiosity in those for whom curiosity has been effectively turned off?
I mean, here, I think the message is just that there is a network there for you, right? There's a history that you are a part of, and there are people to connect to, and there are questions waiting for you in your that belong to you. Like, I think of my own recovery of sort of trans history. There are questions that now belong to me, and there are people and thinkers that to whom I now also belong. And I didn't know that. I didn't grow up knowing that. I didn't know that in college. I didn't know that in grad school, right? But the network is there, and you may be a lost node, but start laying out edges, and other people will kind of grab your hand as another edge, I think, and you're not alone.